20 years earlier, another house was pulled apart by police as they searched for victims of a Chicago businessman. At the time, he was America's worst mass murderer. 1978, police arrived at a house in Des Plaines, Illinois, near Chicago. They were investigating the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Peast 10 days before. He had failed to return from his night job at a local pharmacy. To the surprise of police, the owner of the house, John Wayne Gacy, invited them in for breakfast. They noticed an unpleasant smell inside. Gacy told them it was coming from the drains, but the officers were unconvinced and left to get a search warrant. When they returned, they opened a trap door to the crawl space beneath the house. There they found the remains of at least 3 bodies. Gacy was immediately arrested and charged with murder. Heavy digging equipment was brought in. A police spokesman explained what was happening.
We feel that we're going to have to go over every inch of the basement regardless.
Before long, bodies were being brought out one by one. There seemed to be no end to the procession of death. As the search continued, police began asking neighbors like Edward Grexa if they'd noticed anything strange at Gacy's house.
Never a sound, not a sound, never. Not even, like they've asked about screaming or anything. Never a sound out of that house. It's always been a quiet house.
Never any noise or anything?
No, other than maybe doing some construction work at night, outside, a little loudness that way, sawing and things like that, but I attribute that to his work.
By now, Gacy had confessed to murdering at least 30 teenagers. He lured them to his house with the promise of a job, then sexually abused them before strangling them with either a rosary or a tourniquet. The bodies were buried in the crawl space under the house. When that became too crowded, the garden. Eventually, there was no room left. So Gacy loaded the bodies of his last 5 victims into his car and threw them off a bridge. One of those victims was Robert Peast. Gacy was now anxious to help and told police where to look for the bodies. He seemed relieved as he confessed to a series of murders that had gone unchecked for 7 years. Gacy was a local building contractor and a popular figure in Chicago's business circles, but he had been leading a double life. As a charity worker, Gacy had visited children's hospitals dressed as a clown. He was even photographed with Rosalind Carter. The mother of one of his victims described him.
He was a very nice man to work for, and he liked the kids. And my son told me he was a politician, and he says, boy, if you stick with that guy, you could go far. He's got a lot of connections. See, and this is what the boys liked about him.
Gacy arrived in Chicago in June 1970, after he was paroled for good conduct. He had served just 2 years of a 10-year prison sentence for sodomy. In 1972, Gacy married divorcee Carol Hoff. Guests at the wedding reception noticed a strange smell. It was the decomposing corpse of his first victim. For a while, Gacy seemed to concentrate on his business and charity work, but he was simultaneously cruising the streets looking for youngsters. Before long, boys started to disappear. Police did what they could, but assumed that some of the boys had probably just run away from home. After a while, Gacy's mood swings became too much for his wife, and she left him. He was now free to do whatever he wanted.
But he seemed to have a problem getting, and then later on the light would come on the outside. And then it'd be 2, 3 in the morning or 4 in the morning. He'd go back out to jump in the car and off he'd go again. Those were the hours that he carried on. But I thought it was business, but it probably was some of this foul play, maybe bringing some of these young people in.
By the time he was arrested in December 1978, Gacy had killed at least 33 teenage boys and disposed of their bodies. A police spokesman tried to explain how Gacy got away with it for so long.
When we in the Chicago Police Department first became aware of this gentleman 2 years ago, we put him under surveillance for over 30-some days, and we could never we never established probable cause that he was committing an offense.
After his arrest, Gacy was put on suicide watch and strapped to his bed with leather restraints. A flood of calls poured in from the parents of missing boys. Medical teams were faced with the gruesome task of sorting out body parts found under the house and in the garden. Cook County Medical Examiner Dr. Robert Stein explained the difficulties.
It's frightening. That's the only word I can use. Frightening.
To the relief of the neighbors, Gacy's house was declared unsafe and demolished. It had become a morbid destination for sightseers and souvenir hunters. Another year passed before Gacy came to trial. His attorney didn't deny the murders, but pleaded that his client was obviously insane. After 6 weeks of listening to evidence, the jury disagreed and found Gacy guilty of more murders than anyone else in U.S. history. In March 1980, John Wayne Gacy was sentenced to death. 14 years later, his sentence was carried out.